For 40 years, Thérèse Neumann only ate a host and had a simple sip of water as her meal. This woman didn't need to eat or drink to live. Thérèse would be under the supervision of 2 doctors and 4 nurses, 24 hours a day.
What happened? How could half of the Germans in 1960 believe that this woman hadn't eaten or drunk anything for over 30 years? You might be jaded. There are charlatans who claim to have supernatural powers. But here, we're not talking about a woman who fooled a few dozen people for a week or 2. No. We're talking about a woman whom thousands of curious people came to see every day for decades, and yet she pulled off what seems to be the biggest hoax of the 20th century. But that's not all. She also claimed, among other things, that she only slept 1 to 2 hours a night, that blood would spontaneously flow from her eyes every Friday, and that she had miraculously healed no less than 7 times. Everyone who has been interested in the paranormal, whether closely or from afar, knows her name, Thérèse Neumann. But is all of this true, or is it simply the best crafted fraud in history? And if everything is false, how did she manage to make tens of millions of people believe her? Let me tell you how. Thérèse Neumann became one of the most famous Germans of the 20th century. By not eating or drinking for over 35 years, well, that's what we're going to find out. It's March 10th, 1918 in Königsstritz, a small village in Bavaria, Germany, where Thérèse's life is about to change. This is where, 20 years earlier, on April 8, 1898, Thérèse was born, the eldest of 9 children, into a Catholic family of rather poor farmers. Thérèse has a normal childhood. She loves nature a lot, especially flowers. At just 14 years old, she is placed with her uncle Martin Neumann to help with the farm work and serve coffee to the customers at his bar. She's already a real tough girl, strong, carrying heavy bags of potatoes and grains weighing between 50 to 75 kilos. But it was on March 10th, 1918, when Thérèse was 20 years old, that the worst happened. As she is on her way to Mass at the village church that morning, she suddenly notices flames coming from the roof of her Uncle Martin's neighboring house. She immediately raises the alarm, and all the villagers start forming a chain to bring buckets of water from the well to the flames. At that time, in fact, the town had neither firefighters nor firefighting equipment. Thérèse is standing on a stool, and she passes the buckets to the person above her in the barn, but the containers weigh between 10 and 25 kilos and the work lasts for hours. Thérèse bends down to grab the buckets, then lifts them above her head. Soon she is completely soaked and freezing from the icy air of that winter morning. Suddenly, as she is bent over, the bucket she is holding slips from her hand because she just felt a sharp pain in her back. She awkwardly climbs down from the stool, doubled over, but has to go home in great pain, remaining stuck, bent forward. In fact, she has what we would call today a slipped disc, but particularly severe because she has dislocated her spine, with the 2nd and 3rd lumbar vertebrae out of place. After a few days, she's not getting any better, but she still tries to be helpful and get back to work. Her loved ones think she caught a bad cold and that it will pass, and she tells herself that too. But at the beginning of April, a second accident happens to Thérèse. As she was carrying a small sack of potatoes from the cellar with incredible effort, she fell backwards. Her head hits a step of the staircase and she faints. When they pick her up, she has a large wound at the base of her skull. And in the days that follow, she will gradually start to lose her sight, having to stop all activities and return to her parents' home. Her condition worsens, and on April 23rd she has to be taken to the Waldsassen hospital. The doctor, Dr. Goebbels, of course not him, diagnoses her with an acute rheumatism crisis with a descent of the stomach. He tries to treat her but with no results, and after 7 weeks, she goes back to her parents' home, and there on August 1st, 1918, the third accident. While she is trying to put her apron in her drawer, she suffers a spinal dislocation that will be diagnosed by Dr. Buchert-Starsberg. The year 1918 for most people was a beautiful year, marking the end of the war. But for Thérèse, no. She is going through the worst months of her life since she was born, because on October 19th, just a little over 6 months after the first accident, while her vision had still worsened, she came to help her former employers the day before a local festival. She then goes up to the attic to get a basket, which is hard to reach, climbs onto a beam, loses her balance, and falls for the 3rd time, hitting her head, the 1st time again on the hard floor. New head injury and fainting. Finally, the 5th and last fall on March 17th, 1919, at the threshold of the family kitchen. From that moment on, she is completely blind. She starts to develop symptoms of paralysis, sometimes having severe convulsions. She ends up completely bedridden, and it is there, in the heart of the 1920s, that Thérèse will transform from a simple, very ill peasant woman into a mysterious figure, surrounded by strange paranormal phenomena. Indeed, over the course of the decade, she will successively heal 7 times very reliably. He is supposedly going to completely stop eating, neither eating nor drinking, starting from August 6, 1926. Of course, you can imagine, the rumors of this unbelievable total absence of food spread from person to person and quickly throughout the entire region. All of this eventually reaches the ears of the Bishop of Regensburg, Monsignor Anton von Henley. Unfortunately, in history, there have been many charlatans who pretended to have supernatural gifts to deceive the crowds. But fortunately, the Catholic Church has always been extremely cautious about this kind of phenomenon, using the Inquisition at the time to expose them. Thus, the bishop is very skeptical and sends observers to Königsruth to be directly informed about what is happening at the Neumann farm. All the testimonies that reach him are unanimous. No one ever sees Therese eat, drink, or buy food. Well, okay, but that's not enough. The bishop would like absolute certainty. She would need to be monitored for days and days on end, 24 hours a day, even at night, never leaving her alone for a single moment, and see if she really doesn't eat or drink anything. So, if she's a fraud, she should be easily exposed. The bishop therefore entrusts the task of conducting this thorough investigation to Dr. Seidel. The choice is not a coincidence. Seidel is a renowned doctor, the chief surgeon at the Valsassen hospital. But above all, a few years earlier, on February 27, 1920, he had the opportunity to briefly meet Therese and had then delivered a diagnosis of hysteria. His document had been signed by 3 of his colleagues, Drs. Frank, Goebbels and Hitzelberger. This diagnosis basically meant that Therese's episodes were indeed real, but that most of her pains and issues, particularly her blindness, stemmed from her psyche. Hysterics, to put it simply, are people who invent problems to attract attention. Interesting. Dr. Seidel is preparing his investigation and has decided that from July 13, 1927, at 1 p.m. to July 28, at the same time, he will have Therese monitored 24 hours a day for 15 consecutive days by 4 nurses he fully trusts. And they must never leave Therese alone, not even for a second. But before I tell you what happened during those 15 days, we need to go back a few years, because there is a central piece of the puzzle to understand the key events of 1927. The famous unexplained healings of Therese. Thérèse Neumann, did she really heal? Not less than 7 times in an inexplicable way? Or were there already suspicions about the authenticity of her healings? This could give us clues to draw the right conclusions from the experiment carried out in July 1927. Above all, remember the name Dr. Seidel. He plays a key role in our entire case. And to grasp the strange healings that took place in the 1920s, I need to tell you about another Therese. A Therese who lived in France, in Normandy, in Lisieux, and who died at the age of 24 from tuberculosis in 1897, which is 1 year before the birth of Thérèse Neumann. She was a very early nun, having entered the convent at just 15 years old. She had written about her life a few months before dying as requested. In just a few years, her writings had spread like wildfire all over the world. Some even estimate that her autobiography, Story of a Soul, has sold over 500 million copies, making it the 4th best-selling book of all time, behind the Bible, the Quran, and the Little Red Book. In short, you got the idea. In the 1920s, she was already extremely well known all over Europe. So, on April 29, 1923, Thérèse Neumann was on her last day of a novena, which is a prayer repeated for 9 days to pray for the beatification of Thérèse of Lisieux. Beatification is when the Catholic Church declares, through a process, that a deceased believer lived a life very close to God. It had been 4 years and 4 months since Thérèse Neumann was blind. Then Thérèse sees the whiteness of her clothes, and above her bed, the image of Thérèse of Lisieux. When her sister Crescens enters the room, Thérèse Neumann asks her who she is. She doesn't recognize her at all. She grew up in 4 years. She has to wait for her to speak to immediately recognize her voice. Everyone around understands the good news. Thérèse has regained her sight. The next day, Thérèse's attending physician, Dr. Seidel, confirms her healing, and Thérèse of Lisieux was beatified on the very same day, like a little wink. Very intriguing, isn't it? It even seems a bit far-fetched. And indeed, some, years later, discovering the facts, denied that Thérèse could have regained her sight like that, thinking that there must be another explanation. The hypothesis of those who don't want to believe this healing is inexplicable claims Thérèse couldn't see anything because she was hysterical. The initial diagnosis by Dr. Seidel on February 27, 1920. Basically, it was all in her head. But then, is it also thought Dr. Seidel himself when he discovered the next day that Thérèse had regained her sight? Well, actually no. because in the meantime, he had become Therese's doctor, and as he got to know her better over the years, he eventually realized that he had actually been wrong about his initial diagnosis of hysteria. He had actually distributed it in an emergency to allow Thérèse to obtain a disability pension, as her state of paralysis fully justified it, and he knew how much of a burden she could be for her poor farming family. But later realizing that some would reuse his initial diagnosis of hysteria against Thérèse Neumann, Dr. Seidel deeply regretted what he called a real blunder, a big mistake. In short, there were 6 other healings that helped to shed some light on the situation. Notably, the well-documented healing of an appendicitis in 1925. It's November 7, 1925, and Thérèse is suffering from unbearable pain in her lower abdomen, and it's not her period. On the evening of November 13th, Dr. Seidel diagnosed a purulent appendicitis with a risk of perforation and orders the transfer of the patient to the Velby clinic. It's ringing at 6 km. There. Once again, there is a connection with Thérèse of Lisieux, as a relic of little Neumann is placed on Thérèse Neumann's abdomen by her loved ones. Suddenly, all the pain disappears, and the next day, Dr. Seidel can examine pus mixed with blood, as well as a sort of small membrane that came out during the night through natural means into the bowl. Even Professor Ewald, who I will talk about later, as he was a staunch anti-Thérèse atheist, had to admit the inexplicable nature of certain healings. Besides blindness and appendicitis, Thérèse will heal from 5 other things in a completely inexplicable way during those years, each time instantly and permanently. In 1925, for example, due to staying in bed, gangrene develops in Thérèse's left foot. Thérèse asks her sister Cléchance to put in her bandage rose petals that had touched the tomb of Thérèse of Lisieux again, and that a priest had offered to her, and after a few minutes the gangrene completely disappears, leaving the skin fresh, as if there was nothing there. Dr. Seidel, witnessing this on May 3rd, 1925, can't believe his eyes. Her colleague, Dr. Gerlich, also considers this healing to be inexplicable. 15 days later, Thérèse of Lisieux is solemnly canonized at the Basilica of St. Peter in Rome, meaning that the Catholic Church declares her a saint. And by the way, that day will be Thérèse Neumann's greatest healing. She then declares that she had a strange vision of a woman full of light in her room. Suddenly, Thérèse, who had been bedridden due to paralysis for 6.5 years, sits up and manages to get into a sitting position. She, who had been lying down since October 1918, then gets up and starts walking without any more pain in her spine. Apparently, yet another healing that Thérèse owes to the other. Thérèse, the French one. In an upcoming study, I will study miracles that Thérèse of Lisieux is said to have performed after her death. There would have been several thousand just between 1900 and 1925, and even today. Subscribe. This will be new content. You got it. I didn't cover all 7 healings. There was also pneumonia. In any case, Thérèse was ill several times and healed each time quickly and permanently. It's hard to say that it was all in her head, especially since that wasn't the opinion of the doctors who had come to know her well over time. And because the psyche can do a lot of things but cannot, until proven otherwise, heal spinal injuries or appendicitis. But by the way, before we get to the famous investigation that checked whether Thérèse Neumann ate anything, if you want to know more, in my previous video, I also studied in depth the hypothesis of hysteria at Thérèse Neumann's. I looked into the holes that formed on Thérèse's hands and feet in 1926 and what are called stigmata, because many different doctors had the opportunity to study them. I give you all their conclusions in my previous video. Check it out later to really get the complete file on Thérèse Neumann. But anyway, let's move on. Now that you have the context and know a bit better, the main protagonist who led the investigation in July 1927. So let's finally talk about those famous 15 days when Thérèse was monitored 24/7 to check if she wasn't eating or drinking anything. The investigation had been requested by the Bishop of Regensburg, Marsancta von Elle, who wanted to finally know the truth about the one who was already attracting thousands of curious visitors every day. So it was Dr. Seidel, the chief surgeon at the Valsasson hospital, who was chosen, and because of her initial diagnosis of hysteria, he was indeed the most skeptical observer one could find. He couldn't carry out the entire monitoring alone, of course, and he carefully chose, among many others, 4 nuns, nurses, graduates, particularly alert and well prepared against the subtle deceptions of neurotics, whom they were actually used to treating. They were 4 Franciscan sisters, belonging to the congregation of the Hospital Sisters of Mallersdorf. Before the investigation, Dr. Seidel, who once again was putting his reputation on the line, gave lengthy instructions to the 4 nurse sisters. The main instruction basically was never leave Thérèse Neumann alone. Not even for a second, neither day nor night, not even to go to the bathroom, nor for any excuse, really nothing. She must never be left alone for a single moment during those 15 days, so she can't eat or drink in secret, you understand? And there always had to be at least 2 nurse sisters to watch over her. Thérèse can never be alone with just one nurse. Well, just so you can realize. In fact, a bit more about the rigor with which the investigation was conducted. I'm putting it in French on the screen for anyone who's interested. The 12 specific instructions that the 4 nurses received. And on top of all that, Dr. Seidel kept himself updated by phone and in writing, and would show up unannounced, accompanied by other volunteer observers, to see how things were going, since he had indeed invited anyone who wanted to freely follow his investigation. The official report of the investigation mentions the 9 most important checks that he wanted to have noted, and some of them took place in the middle of the night. Well, here are now the conclusions of the investigation that was conducted. During those 15 days and 15 nights straight, Thérèse did not consume a single trace of solid or liquid food, except for about an eighth of a host for her daily communion, accompanied by a few drops of water to help with swallowing. And that's it. And since everything was weighed and measured, we can say very precisely what she absorbed. In total, during the 15 days, 0.33 grams of host and 45 cm3 of water. I remind you that the hosts are made of flour, wheat and water. Basically, it's bread. So that's about this much bread and this much water. I don't know if you can see it well over the entire 15 days. At the end of the experiment, by the way, the blood that flowed from these stigmata and the blood taken from the left earlobe were subjected to analysis. There were no signs of a lack of nutrition. Basically, it's as if she had been eating normally. But the craziest part is that her weight was rigorously monitored, the same on July 28th at 1 p.m. as on August 13th. Not eating had no effect on Thérèse Neumann. Moreover, the weigh-ins done several times a day confirmed twice the authenticity of a phenomenon as inexplicable as perpetual fasting. This phenomenon also occurred consistently during each painful ecstasy. It consisted of Thérèse Neumann spontaneously regaining the approximately 4 kilograms she lost during her bloody ecstasy on Friday. Her normal weight at that time was 55 kilograms. On Friday evening she weighed only 51, and by Sunday morning she was back to 55. So right away you might be thinking, and that would be a normal reaction, that there must have been some cheating somewhere. But Dr. Evold, invited to join the investigation, was a staunch opponent of the mystical thesis. His whole life, he fought against Thérèse Neumann. Even he had to admit the 4 nursing sisters had perfectly fulfilled their mission. The 4 sisters from Malersdorf made a strong impact on me. They had been skillfully chosen. From a medical standpoint, they left nothing to be desired. They certainly couldn't be fooled. Neither the ecstasies nor the sight of blood made them lose their heads. They stood there, impassive, with the camera in hand. Perfectly disciplined, they followed Dr. Siedel's instructions with the utmost punctuality. They were told to watch Therese. For a second, they fulfilled their mandate to perfection. As far as I know from their report, it was objective, unassailable, and reflected the healthiest criticism. Having completed their task, they immediately stepped away, happy to be done with it. None of them expressed the wish to see the patient in the state of ecstasy that was supposed to occur the following day. At different times, they firmly opposed any attempts by third parties to interfere in the investigation. And in his report, Dr. Evold also admits that despite the most careful observation, they could not once confirm that Thérèse Neumann, who was not alone for a second, must have absorbed something or must have tried in some way to absorb something. Thérèse Neumann's bed was not only thoroughly inspected at the beginning of the check, but it was also made every day, not as one might think by the parents, but by the sisters. Neither the doctor nor the sisters agreed. That one could think that observational errors were made regarding the intake of food. In short, through this rigorous and continuous 360-hour monitoring, Dr. Seidel will therefore explain that the question of Thérèse Neumann's total lack of nutrition was definitively resolved. In any case, he would not conduct a new investigation, as he couldn't reach a more conclusive result. Even if Thérèse were to start eating again afterward, it would still remain undeniable that during the 15 days of his own experience, she had taken no food. But actually, it's not so much the fact that she doesn't eat that's impressive. No, it's 2 things that defy the laws of physics. Here, the first thing is the fact of not eating and not losing weight at the same time, because you cannot eat for 15 days, but in that case you will lose weight. For example, the official world record for not eating is 382 days. She was obese, weighing 207 kilos, losing 125 kilos in over a year without food. What defies science in Thérèse Neumann's experiment is she weighed the same. The second surprising thing is the fact of not drinking. The body can survive without eating, losing weight, but no more than 3 days without drinking. Indeed, without drinking, the body goes into distress. Thirst grows, lips dry out, and urine concentrates. After 12 hours, fatigue and dizziness begin, blood pressure drops. In 24 hours, headaches appear, confusion worsens, and any physical activity becomes difficult. After 48 hours, the person is disoriented, the heart struggles to pump blood, and the organs begin to suffer. At 72 hours, dehydration reaches its peak, causing multi-organ failure, coma, and, without intervention, certain death. So, Thérèse Neumann didn't lose weight, even though she ate nothing. Except for a few drops a day, during the investigation, is completely inexplicable. Scientifically, we're facing another Catholic miracle, the 15th in our series on 104 miracles. Not totally convinced yet. The thing is, even if this rigorous investigation by Dr. Seidel hadn't taken place, Thérèse Neumann's lack of food for 36 years would still leave no doubt. A hoax is more extraordinary than no food. In a way, it's more extraordinary than the absence of food itself. And it's actually quite simple to understand. In reality, the investigation didn't just last for 15 days, but we can say it went on uninterrupted for 36 years. Well, yes, because for more than 35 years, Thérèse Neumann was continuously observed by relatives, doctors, and especially by thousands of visitors every day. If there had been a hoax, it would seem completely unbelievable that among the constant observers of Thérèse Neumann, especially her family, no one would have noticed. And then, it's hard to understand what the motive for the hoax would be. What's certain is that Thérèse wasn't looking to be famous or to get rich. She had been offered astronomical sums of money several times, which she always refused. Once, an American film company even went so far as to offer $500,000 to film just one of her bloody ecstasies, which was of course turned down as Thérèse was not a sideshow attraction.
As for the fact of attracting many visitors, Thérèse would say, there are too many curious people coming here like it's a show, and they would have been better off going to pray at the church than to come see me.
In short, she was deeply humble and avoided the spotlight. One day, a theologian asked her about her mysticism level, how holy she was.
But she, who didn't think of herself as any better than anyone else, replied, if that's what you came all this way to ask me, you would have been better off staying at home. We don't care about the degrees of mysticism. We simply focus on loving the Savior a little more each day.
But that needs to be said too. Thérèse didn't have to go to the bathroom. She never isolated herself during the day. Yes, seems silly, but it's important. Moreover, from Thursday midnight until Sunday morning, she was bedridden from her Friday ecstasies, which we studied in the previous video. The number of unofficial investigators who observed her, especially during those dramatic weekends, is indeed large. An example among others is that of Anne Spiegel, who was just a simple German shopkeeper. Intrigued by this case, she wanted to conduct her own little investigation homemade. Well, here is as an example what Anne Spiegel will write in her book about Thérèse Neumann.
I stayed with her for 10 weeks. I could enter her room at any time and without knocking. I helped her clean her room. As a shopkeeper, you have a sharp mind and you catch on quickly. That's the nature of the profession. Often, I spent weeks in Eichstätt with her. I was the one who helped her pack and unpack her little suitcase. I never found anything suspicious there. To keep it hidden for 36 years, what we eat and what we drink and what we need to eliminate. And on top of that, when thousands of people are watching you intently, it would have been just as big a miracle as not consuming any food. I was making lunch for everyone. I stirred the food with a spoon and said to Therese, who was next to me, taste it to see if I've spiced it enough. And I offered her the spoon, but she shook her head. So I said to her, can you lick with your tongue? Then she explained, look, I can't. Even when my lips are dry, when they crack and bleed, I can't touch them with my tongue, or else it chokes me. I asked her if she wasn't hungry, if she could willingly give up eating. Then she became sad and said, I often prayed to the Lord to let me eat like other people. Do you think it's easy for me to be hungry?
And then Thérèse would sometimes go for days or weeks to rest with friends or at a convent, because in Königsruth she was always overwhelmed by visitors, and there too no one saw her eat, drink or isolate herself. Edmund Boniface recalls a funny scene at the Connors Road Inn. Visitors, new and skeptical, spoke to the innkeeper. But really, is it true that she doesn't eat or drink anything? Never. Not a crumb. Not a drop? The innkeeper then replied to them, do you think people here are more naive than elsewhere? And be the joke of the world. The day they discover that Thérèse doesn't live without eating or drinking after all this time, no one there would have noticed anything. Really, do you think that's possible? And do you think that if she ate, she wouldn't need to go out sometimes like everyone else? Somewhere, because when we eat, there are difficult consequences to hide. At that, a big hearty laugh erupted, which Edmund Boniface joined in. There's even one last piece of evidence that adds to it, as if Thérèse Neumann's lack of nourishment wasn't already obvious enough. It's the proof by the teeth Indeed, on May 5th, 1931, a dentist from Eichstätt, Dr. Dieu, had the opportunity to provide care for Therese's teeth. We took the opportunity to ask him for his opinion on Therese's lack of nourishment. Well, here is an excerpt from his very enlightening report. Regarding Therese of Königsruth's lack of nutrition that began in 1926, I then make the following statements. At the beginning of the treatment, I was made aware that a gag reflex would occur as soon as a single drop of liquid fell into the throat. Odd tooth shapes. I noted this decay differed from other dentitions. The destroyed teeth in various shapes shone, smooth, and deposit-free. The uniformity of these tooth remnants was unique. I reflected. This dentition existed for years. A stagnation of the decomposition process that had strongly begun. This stagnation of decay couldn't have occurred if the normal bacterial flora had been present. In the mouth, this leads to decomposition and putrefaction. There shouldn't have been any factors causing cavities in Therese's mouth anymore, because it's human food that nourishes a person, which, as carriers of microorganisms, destroy the teeth. We find ourselves, in this case, faced with the phenomenon of the absence of nutrition. Basically, to put it simply, Therese's teeth, when observed by the dentist, actually corresponded very exactly to teeth that had no longer been in contact with not a trace of food for years. But in reality, Thérèse Neumann still had her little secret. There was still something that gave her strength, her energy in daily life. When she was asked one day, "But what do you live on?" she replied, "On the Redeemer." In reality, it was the daily communion that gave her all her energy. For Catholics, communion is about eating Jesus, who truly comes in this small consecrated host, because Jesus said it in the Gospel of John, chapter 6, verse 53, "Unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you." The role that food generally plays for the human body has thus been replaced for Thérèse by the consecrated host transformed into the body and the blood of Christ. Moreover, when for one reason or another she couldn't receive communion for a day or two, she would lose all her energy and feel extremely weak, just like someone who hadn't eaten. And God might have a sense of humor. Thérèse ended her life almost overweight, in any case quite plump, to say the least. When asked how it was possible, Thérèse would respond with her usual cheerfulness and a big smile, "It seems that God doesn't do things by halves." Well, yes. As Jesus said in John chapter 6 verse 55, "My flesh is true food and my blood is true drink." For those who are interested, I actually conducted a complete investigation into the Eucharistic miracles. All the miracles related to what is just a small piece of bread. In short, the case of Thérèse Neumann, meaning her lack of nutrition, becomes obvious to anyone who accepts the facts and doesn't want to be in denial. Indeed, it was perfectly confirmed both by a rigorous 15-day investigation that no one dared to question it. Perfectly carried out through a continuous life of observation by thousands of people who saw her. Never eating, never drinking, never buying food, never isolating herself to go to the bathroom. This unexplained event was the 15th Catholic miracle in our series. But I have another one to present to you. You might be starting to understand that the life of Thérèse of Neumann was a long series of mystical events. In my previous video, we saw that she had the stigmata. During this inquiry, we saw she healed mysteriously. And actually, how can I put it? There are still 2 to 3 things I need to show you. You're not done with your surprises already. One very strange thing is that Thérèse hardly ever slept, as if, once again, she had a supernatural energy that allowed her not to need rest. Here is her typical schedule, literally uncopyable. During the day, aside from the ecstasies or visions, she mostly engaged in the normal activities of a peasant, especially gardening and also maintaining the church, visiting the poor or the sick in the area, or receiving her own visitors. In the evening, she often did sewing or household chores. At midnight, she would go to the church and spend an hour in adoration, praying for an hour in front of the Blessed Sacrament, Jesus present in the consecrated host for Catholics. Then she would return to her room where until 4 a.m. she would go through her mail, always large. She would then lie down on her bed, and if she wasn't sleeping, she would meditate or pray until 6 a.m. She would then return to the church and prepare for the 7 a.m. Mass. After Mass, she would return home, where a new day would begin. Her schedule was disrupted by Friday ecstasies or trips. Essentially, she literally slept 1 to 2 hours, max per day. However, sleeping so little daily is unsustainable long-term, as the human body needs a minimum of 7 to 9 hours of sleep per night to regenerate. This chronic lack of sleep should quickly lead to irreversible damage, including impaired cognitive functions, constant fatigue, psychological disorders, and a failure of the immune system. In short, this would increase the risk of serious illnesses like heart problems, diabetes, and depression, rendering this unsustainable and dangerous. Yet, once again, Thérèse was in great shape during the day and was very available to welcome or chat with anyone. Wanted it till 4 or 5 in the morning, and by 6 o'clock, well, here's something completely crazy. Thérèse had visions where she saw scenes from the life of Jesus, particularly his passion. When she told others, Therese gave historical details later verified. Every time the details given by Therese were authentic. For example, she described accurately the clothing and physical characteristics of the figures she saw in her visions. She provided realistic details about the topography, monuments that baffled even the most knowledgeable experts. For example, a specialist once asked her to provide details that astonished him about the staircases and interior rooms of the Temple of Herod. Another example among many others. Thérèse once explained that she saw Bethlehem illuminated at night by means of street lamps made from tall poles, at the end of which pots or pitch were burned. This detail was confirmed by historians. She could have invented all the details she reported without error. From a historical point of view, it seems weak. But there is something much stranger that definitely attests to the truth of her visions. Sometimes she would repeat aloud words or phrases that she heard during her ecstasies. And of course, those who had the chance to be in the room to witness her visions understood nothing. We thought it might be ancient languages or lost dialects. In any case, the only certainty is that no one knew these languages here in Kanashat. And when Thérèse came out of her ecstasy, she was unable to say what language she had spoken or to say it again. Not a single one of the words she might have spoken. All she said was that she had heard Jesus or other figures speaking and that she understood everything, as if it were her mother tongue. But it was then the village priest, Father Naber, suggested contacting Professor Wutz, a specialist in the Old Testament at the Catholic faculty of Eichstätt and an expert in Semitic languages and Palestinian archaeology. Professor Wutz then had the opportunity to witness a vision, and it shocked him. He notes that the language Thérèse speaks is Aramaic, the mother tongue of Jesus, which of course she never learned. He even notes that she has a slight accent when pronouncing the G's or R's, and that she tends to confuse D's and T's, as well as B's and P's. But aside from that, it's definitely Aramaic. Very quickly, the information spreads and is made public through a report by Baron Hervé von Martin published in L'Inkur, a supplement of the Münchener Neueste Nachrichten on August 3rd, 1927, which becomes a hit. His report will be translated into 32 languages. This then attracts some semitologists, that is to say, language experts from several countries. In total, more than a dozen of them will go to see Thérèse Neumann to observe one of her visions. And all of them will be able to confirm Professor Wout's statements. Among the experts who confirmed that Thérèse Neumann spoke Aramaic during her visions, we have Dr. Spiegel, Dr. Kurtz, Dr. Gerlich, Dr. Wessely, Dr. Joseph Parakatil, Dr. Kirchenscheiner, Dr. Rudolf Meyer, Dr. Erwin von Martin, Dr. Walter Inz from Göttingen, and finally Dr. Kiefer. But in addition to Aramaic, Thérèse also sometimes spoke in Neo-Hebrew, Greek, and even other languages. For example, at one point, Jesus on the cross says, "I thirst." Now for the phrase "I thirst," the semitologists were expecting the term "sachena," but Thérèse surprised them by declaring she had heard "etche." Back home, Wout found, by consulting his books, that it was a Neo-Hebrew word also meaning "I thirst." On this subject, Professor Wessely wrote, "Here's a riddle that no suggestion hypothesis will be able to solve. There are many striking examples. So, once, for example, during a vision of Our Lady of Lourdes, she started speaking something that resembled French. But the semitologist experts were surprised to find that it was French that seemed very distorted, too distorted. And in fact, what was their surprise when, after verification by Professors Woods and Gerlich, they found these words matched the dialect of the Pyrenees, the native language of Saint Bernadette Soubirous, who had seen the apparition of Martin at Lourdes. There will also be an investigation into Lourdes, so subscribe to stay updated. I could give you many more examples of unknown languages that Thérèse started to speak, but let's continue with other mystical phenomena. And for those who want to know more, once again, all the sources are in this excellent book. Thérèse also had the gift of bilocation, meaning she could be in two places at once. For example, when she was bedridden during travel, she would spiritually attend Mass. She could repeat what the priest had said, often noticing details like wilted flowers next to the altar. Once, for example, Thérèse attended Mass in Berlin, in a church where she had never read or heard anything about it. The description of the church matched with this one, and even more surprisingly, she was able to recount a priest and altar server's talk, and this would later be confirmed. A Kunnersroth worker once decided to end his life by jumping in front of a train. He then saw a woman with holes in her hands distracting him as the train passed behind them. The unfortunate man burst into tears and was convinced by the woman to go find the village priest, Father Naber, to tell him about his distress and ask for advice. Later he saw the woman he had seen was Therese Neumann, yet on the day of his suicide attempt, Thérèse Neumann, of course, had not left her home. Bilocations weren't frequent in Thérèse's life, but there were for this well-documented phenomenon. My next investigation will focus on 4 impressive, well-documented historical bilocations. Subscribe to not miss it. It's shocking. Therese could heal. For Catholics, it is God who heals. But God can work through his friends, the saints. 14:12, amen, amen, I say to you. Whoever believes in me will do the works that I do, and will do even greater works. The healings of Thérèse Neumann before and after her death are numerous. But to give one example, there's the case of Carl Schmitz Wickermann, the owner of a marble business in Rhineland. One day he had a serious accident while driving. A child suddenly threw himself in front of his car, and in his attempt to avoid it, he slammed on the brakes. This sudden movement caused bruises and, above all, dislocated 2 vertebrae, damaging his nerves. None of the treatments he tried managed to relieve him, and he found himself forced to wear a rigid orthopedic corset all the time. Walking without 2 crutches was impossible for him. But even worse than his physical incapacity, the agony made his life hell. The consulted doctors, powerless, declared him incurable, and he was forced to stop all professional activity. Out of human solutions, Carl decided to go to Königsrud, hoping that Thérèse Neumann, famous for her stigmata and deep spiritual life, could pray for him. Thérèse agreed to do a novena, which means 9 days of prayer. However, after a few days, Carl felt no improvement. And feeling discouraged, he decided to go back home. His wife, equally desperate, shared his opinion. Together, they took the road back, ready to continue the novena from their home. It was while they were traveling, as they were approaching the city of Paderborn, that the unexpected happened. Carl suddenly felt, without warning, the complete disappearance of his pain. He realized with astonishment that he was instantly healed. Wasting no time, he removed his corset and crutches, regaining mobility easily. His pain never returned. In gratitude for this healing, Carl Wickermann decided to fund the erection of a monumental cross, more than 5 meters high, in the cemetery of Königsrud after Therese's death. Another supernatural phenomenon with Thérèse Neumann was levitation. This phenomenon was confirmed repeatedly, starting in the 1930s. In 1938, Dr. Steiner reported that during a vision at the Steiner convent, Thérèse was in ecstasy, 15-20 centimeters above ground. Moreover, Thérèse had many other gifts. A gift of prophecy, since she had predicted events to her loved ones, confirmed by many testimonies. A gift of hierognosis, since she was able to recognize sacred objects, like relics. For example, once, there were 8 people in her room witnessing one of her visions, and suddenly she said, "There is something bitter here," as if she had sensed something. And indeed, a Franciscan priest present in the room had a relic that was a piece of the Virgin Mary's veil. She also had a gift of cardiognosis. Sometimes she could know people's hearts. For example, once some people came to see her, and Thérèse said, "There is someone here who does not believe." And indeed, among a group that had come to see her, one of them was a skeptic who had come out of curiosity. She often saw her guardian angel and could know the fate of certain deceased individuals. There's more to explore. To learn more, you can subscribe to the edifiant.fr newsletter for quality reports on Catholic faith topics, or 1000 Reasons to Believe, which I will discuss soon. In short, you got it. The supernatural phenomena, other than the lack of nourishment or the stigmata, were extremely abundant. With Thérèse of Mantes for 40 years, from her first miraculous healing in 1923, till her death on September 18, 1962, and all of these supernatural phenomena, aside from the stigmata and the lack of nourishment, were therefore the 16th, an inexplicable mystery in our series of 100. If you are really searching for the truth about God, if you are wondering whether there is a true religion, and if so, which one, well, let me just show you how there is clear evidence that converges towards the Catholic faith. Because if we only looked at the stigmata or the lack of nourishment of Thérèse Neumann, either of these two phenomena alone would already be sufficient in itself to prove that the Catholic faith is true. Each phenomenon independently confirms a Catholic doctrine. Lack of nourishment confirms Jesus in the Eucharist, as Thérèse drew energy from it. If Jesus is truly present, it confirms Catholicism and Christianity. Stigmata confirm Christian faith and Christ's resurrection. Each phenomenon, well documented, confirms truth. They confirm the Catholic faith for truth seekers. This is level 1. A sufficient reason to become Catholic. Let's move on to level 2. Level 2 is to take these phenomena, adding miraculous healings, speaking in foreign languages, lack of sleep, cardiognosis, levitation, bilocation, and other mystical phenomena of Thérèse Neumann. If we take all the facts that Thérèse Neumann experienced, so how much more we understand the mystical Catholic hypothesis explains everything well. All facts taken together strengthen this case and exclude any thesis of hysteria or deception. We can move on to level 3, where Thérèse Neumann only counts 3 miracles out of the 100 cases, and all of them confirm the Catholic faith. Level 1 affirms Catholicism, level 2 and 3 confirm even more. There is no doubt now possible except for those who want to be in denial. And we could add a fourth level, showing over 1,000 reasons for the truth of the Catholic faith. That's what the project aims to show. 1,000 reasons to believe, listing hundreds of arguments on their site, which I highly recommend you check out. I'm putting a link for you to subscribe to their super newsletter in the description. So we see that the multitude of cases at all times and in every place on the planet leaves absolutely no room for doubt. Catholic miracles as well documented as the stigmata or the unique Thérèse Neumann number in the thousands. And today truly anyone who seeks the truth with an open heart can find it. That's exactly why I make these videos. And friends, if you want to support my work of informing this world that doesn't know about all these miracles, feel free to support my channel monthly. Even with €1 or €2 a month, it helps a lot. I'm putting a link in the description and in the pinned comment. Now friends, don't just stop there. Miracles are great, but if it's to satisfy curiosity, it's pointless. As Bishop Buschberger said, Bishop Thérèse Neumann from 1927 to 1961, the life of holiness is humility and in the love of God. Humility is essential. But may this message from Könnersrud be noticed even more than the miraculous phenomena or those related to miracles. Yes, really, all that matters now is for us to live our lives with God, because the greatest miracles are the ones that God wants to perform in your life right now. So, for those who are interested, I've actually created a complete guide to living with God that you can find on a dedicated platform. I'm putting a link in the description. Don't miss out. The lessons from this training can literally change your life and turn you from a spectator of miracles into an actor of miracles. I guarantee it. God bless you indeed. This was Inis. Goodbye.